Today is June 20th, 2024. This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And yesterday I received a message from a prospective parent. I don't believe the parent has a child enrolled in the academy, but it seemed from the message that the parent had a child enrolled in a local school, was not happy with that school, was thinking about homeschooling, but was concerned that the child would be lonely if he was homeschooled. And so this was the nature of the message and the question, will homeschooling children be lonely? And what I'd like to talk about a bit is the problem with this question, the problem with this approach to thinking about education and homeschooling in particular, and how we should think about it, and where the solution to this concern really lies. Because I think there's a big elephant in the room that homeschooling companies that are trying to sell products and homeschooling parents don't want to talk about. They try to avoid the glaring problem and pretend that the problem is actually caused by some other factor. And that's simply not true. So if you bear with me, I'd like to dig into this a little bit, and it may be uncomfortable. I'm going to talk frankly about this because I'd like to be helpful, and we're not going to be helpful if we play salesperson and try to always butter up the customer. When we look at our children and think about their education, we should be asking one question, and it is, what can we do to provide our children with the best intellectual formation? That's the purpose of education. Any other concern that we have is outside of the concern of education. If we're concerned with our children making friends, that has nothing to do with education. If we're concerned about the sacraments, that has nothing to do with education. If we're concerned about social activities or extracurricular activities like sports or music, that has nothing to do with formal education. We should be looking at our children's formal education thinking about only one thing, and that's their intellectual formation. And as parents, we have a duty to fulfill, which is to provide for the intellectual formation of our children. And our ability to provide for that depends on many different things. It depends on our own intellectual ability. It depends on our resources, what people and services we have access to, where we live, what schools might be available, and many other things. But the first problem that I'd like to address is this sort of fake questioning about education that's common in modern society, where parents are looking for a place to put their kids. They've already got commitments to business and to other activities, maybe their own social activities, their own way of life, standard of living, and so on. And now they have children. The children reach school age, and they're like, ugh, what are we going to do with these kids? Where can we put them? Well, that's not an educational question. That's a parenting question. And traditionally, that was handled by hiring nannies to watch the children. It had nothing to do with schooling, nothing to do with education. Education, again, is about intellectual formation. So if you're concerned about a career, and you've got to go put in the 9 to 5, and both parents are going to work, and you're going to have a certain quality of life, or you don't have enough money to afford for one parent to work, I really don't know why we're talking about homeschooling. Homeschooling is about intellectual formation, just as schooling should be. But I understand that schooling in American society is rarely about intellectual formation and really about other issues. And the school is just a daycare service with educational services added to it. So if we're going to talk about education, I'm going to restrict that discussion to intellectual formation. And I'm going to say that you're probably not going to find a good school locally that's going to develop your child intellectually. That's not what modern schools are designed to do. That's not what the The public school model, the K to 12 model, it's not designed for intellectual formation. And so you're always going to be frustrated if you have desires to see your children developed intellectually and challenged intellectually, and you're sending them to school because the schools are not designed for that. And even the fake classical education movement, it's just a variation on the public school model. It's still not going to address the core issues. So when you consider homeschooling, which is where I believe the solutions are in the present generation, when you consider homeschooling, there are a lot of issues to think about. You're taking responsibility upon yourself as parents, and I'm talking about both parents. You're taking responsibility upon yourself for the intellectual development of your children. They get only one childhood, they get only one shot at formal education during their youth before they hit adulthood and gain their independence and choose to go off on their own pursuits in life. You've got one chance while the children are legally in your control to provide them with an education that is supposed to be according to your own convictions. And if you don't get it right, it's an opportunity in life that you can't get a second chance at. And so it's very important. But we've got to talk about the issues because I think that schools and children are blamed for things that are really problems with parent culture, parent issues, and so on. So that's what I'd like to talk to. That's how I'd like to answer this question. Will my child be lonely if he or she is homeschooled? When we hear that question, it's clear that there are a few characters involved in the question. First of all, there's the child. Will my child be lonely? Then there's this assumption that there should be some other people involved. That's a second character in this question. And then there's homeschooling, which is sort of the third factor, I guess I could say. So we've got the child, and we've got other people, and then we've got homeschooling. And notice who's missing. Who's missing in this question is the parent. Will my child be lonely if he or she is homeschooled? Now, I would say that the number one problem in homeschooling, the problem that I am constantly fighting against, the problem that I see hindering everything we do, has nothing to do with the children. It's got nothing to do with the form of schooling, because the form of schooling is already available. It's got nothing to do with the curriculum or the content. The content is already available. The weak link in this chain of education in the present generation is with the parents. The parents are the weak link because they've got very unrealistic education, very unrealistic expectations. Intellectually, they're very immature. They're very selfish. They've gotten used to a very lazy and selfish culture in modern society that they take for granted. And they're ready to blame other things, other people, even their own children, for their frustrations in life. And they're just not willing to look at themselves and be honest and solve the real problem, address the real problem, find realistic solutions to the problem. And the problem is their own thinking. And in an article I posted on the website yesterday, I addressed a couple of these problems, which I'd like to talk about a little bit more since speaking is a bit freer than writing. And I'd like to get into this to try to solve this problem because it's definitely an obstacle for many parents. And we've got to deal with it frankly because it's important for the kids, and we just have to stop fooling ourselves because in order for us to find real salvations, we've got to deal with the real problem. I mean, real solutions. We've got to deal with the real problem and not keep kicking it out of the way. So the real problem is that personally, as adults, we lack culture. As adults, as parents, we're lazy. We like to be home. We like to be comfortable. We like to be idling around. We like to be hanging out in the kitchen, hanging out in the family room, and so on. We like to participate in social and leisure activities, and we waste tons of time. I mean, hours and hours a day, tens, dozens of hours a week are just wasted. If we were to give an account at the end of the hour for what we did with that previous hour, with the energy of that previous hour, we wouldn't even be able to explain what we've done or give an account for how we're using our time. My wife and I, when we were first married, I I took a verse from an old moral poetry book that I had, and I had my wife cross stitch it into a decoration for the wall when we got married. And it said, "How many, by wise management of time, from low degrees have mounted to sublime? How many, by wise management of time, from low degrees have mounted to sublime?" And my wife and I always focused from the very beginning of our marriage, we focused on making effective use of time, trying to make the best of every hour of every day, and always be accomplishing things in each hour, and not having this sort of lazy, wandering social culture that's so common in America. Um, we always have had schedules, and the schedules have not been designed to try to cram as many activities as possible into them. They've always been designed to help us to focus on our priorities. For example, daily prayer. The schedule has always been organized around the hours of prayer. It's never been organized around meals. It's never been organized around leisure activities or social activities. It's always been around our daily prayers, our daily work, our responsibilities each day, and everything else is just stuck in available spaces. So, for example, I don't have a scheduled lunch break. I'll eat my lunch while I do something else. I don't have a coffee break in the morning or coffee hour. I'll drink my coffee while I'm saying morning prayer. The focus is always on the essential activities, and then everything else is treated as we'll do it as time allows, and that includes meals, that includes sleep, just anything else is if time allows, because we've got work to do today, and many people depend on that work. And I'm not talking about the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I'm talking about as parents, we've got lots of work to do today, and other people, our children, other families, our church, our parents, our community, they depend upon us getting that work done. And we've got to do it for God's sake and for their sake. That's what it means to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Other people depend on us, and we've got to make the most of our time, energy, resources, because we've got to do our job to help other people do their job. And we want to be the people in society that get this ball moving and create the momentum that other people can participate in with that momentum already developed like a flywheel. It makes it easier for everyone else to participate. So that's what Christians are supposed to do with respect to goodness and truth. They're supposed to be the sources, the sort of the first movers of good activity in the community, humanly speaking. God, of course, is the first mover, really. But humanly speaking, Christians are the first movers who are supposed to get good things going, and then others benefit from the work of Christians. They're the salt of the earth. They're the light of the world. So as parents, we've got to take responsibility for that. We can't get lost in our careers and use secular work as an excuse to neglect everything else. Many people think that earning a living is the end of man, and they'll do anything and just say, "Oh well, you gotta earn a living." Yeah, but you've got to earn a living in a certain way. You've got to earn a living for the sake of an end that's higher than earning a living. Earning a living is not the chief end of man. Your method of earning a living has to be aimed at the chief end. And if it's not, that's got to be fixed. You can't just ignore it. And for many Christian families, they're just ignoring that glaring problem in their life, that their pursuit of a so-called living is not in alignment with the chief end of their lives. And when people choose to get married, their earning a living is not aimed at the chief end for the sake of the spouse. And then when they have children, their way of earning a living is not aimed at the chief end for all of their children. And we've got to constantly realign ourselves and make sure that everything that we're doing is leading to the chief end. And again, when we marry or have children, we take upon ourselves the responsibility of leading other people to their chief end. And we've got to constantly examine what we're doing and ask if we're actually doing that. And if we're not doing that, we can't use making a living as an excuse to not do that. That's what it means to be a parent. It's one who guides. We're guiding them to a target. We're guiding them like an archer guiding an arrow, aiming and firing the arrow at a target. It's not coincidental, I think, that children are spoken of as arrows in a man's quiver in the Old Testament. Think of the significance of that. And I'm not saying that was the intended meaning of that passage, but I think it points us to a good illustration for how parents ought to think of their children. Are we actually aiming at the chief end, or are we just running all over the place like some a drunk man on a wild horse, just shooting arrows all over the place? When I talk to people, it seems that that's what they're doing. They're just, they're firing arrows, but man, they're shooting all over the place. There's no plan. There's no order. There's no consistency, no routine, no focus, no schedule, just activity running all over like a fly buzzing around a room. And that's why I say when we get into homeschooling questions and socialization questions about whether kids will be lonely, do we have the parent part all fixed and organized first? Because the parents are the administrators of a homeschool. The parents are the homeschool. So anything we're going to ask about the homeschool, we're going to be knocking on the parents' door, because the parents are the principals of the school. And so for the parent to be saying this, is there going to be, who are you asking? It's your homeschool. You're the one to determine that. So you shouldn't be asking questions about homeschooling. You should be determining and establishing what the homeschool is and what the homeschool does. You're the administrator of the homeschool. It's not someone else's job. Now, one of the confusing factors in this is that other homeschool programs present themselves as if they're schools, which is it's just a lie. A homeschool program is not a school. Even something like Seton, which has a school on the ground and then has this homeschool program, and they present diplomas and things like that, that's really a sham, because to be in a school is to be present. And when children are not present, they're not in a school. So when the state looks at education, what they're really concerned about is where the children are, who's responsible for their daily activity, who's responsible for their education, who's actually supervising and directing their learning, who's responsible, who's accountable for their education. And these online homeschool programs, they're not accountable. And I know they present themselves as schools, but it's really a sham that we have to learn to think rightly about, because many parents go into homeschooling talking about homeschool programs as if the program is the homeschool, when the reality is the parents are the homeschool, and they simply don't take responsibility for what the homeschool does. They act like, they're sitting in a bus that somebody else is driving, and it's like, hey, you're the driver. Get in the driver's seat, because this bus is driving all over the place. It's your homeschool. You're the administrator. People contact me asking about diplomas and transcripts, and I say, I don't know what you're talking about. You're the homeschool administrator. You can do whatever you want. We're simply here as a service offering resources and support services, expert tutoring, things like that, to help you administer your homeschool. So I don't know who you're asking about, what your children's experience is going to be when, You're the one who needs to answer that question. So I think that the problem with homeschooling is that parents don't have realistic plans. They're not committed to the mission of homeschooling. They're really not concerned with leading their children successfully through their education. They're doing it for other reasons, and they're looking around like someone else is supposed to be doing things for them rather than taking responsibility for themselves, because homeschooling is a heroic undertaking for parents. It's necessary in our generation because schools are simply not effective. It's especially important because of technology, which makes homeschooling parents capable of things that parents were never capable of in the past. And so it's a very great opportunity for Christian families, but it is a heroic and sacrificial undertaking that parents really have to be prepared for, and they've got to commit to it they've got to commit to it as a mission, with the mission's goal as the only criteria for success in what they do. And most homeschool families don't do that. Many homeschool families I see, they're committed to their own leisure or their own social activity. Mom's thinking about hanging out with other women, or having the children hang out with other children, go to all kinds of activities or co-op events and things like that. There's little to no concern for the actual intellectual formation of the children. There's little concern for what's actually necessary, absolutely speaking, for intellectual formation. This isn't a simple subject. Checking off boxes for K to 12 requirements is not taking responsibility for the intellectual formation of a child. And when we look back at Catholic history, we see that the church fathers, great philosophers, doctors of the church, they have taught very clearly on what's necessary for intellectual formation, and we're either pursuing that or we're not. And for almost all homeschools, I would say, and definitely most schools, we're not pursuing the things that wise men and saints have told us we should be pursuing, the things that they themselves pursued. And that's really the first problem that we've got to address. So let's separate intellectual formation from all of the other concerns we have for our children. Now, when we do that, let's leave intellectual formation off, because in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we have access to everything necessary for that intellectual formation. There's no mystery. There's no controversy over what needs to be done. It's all laid out, and the kids simply need to do it. And their parents have to help them do it and provide help for them to do it. It's very simple. So intellectual formation is not the concern anymore. The concern is with all of these complementary issues that surround the intellectual formation, which ultimately cause homeschools to fail, which ultimately prevent kids from having a good education. And they're largely social. Now think about it. What kind of people normally think about homeschooling? What kind of people normally think about homeschooling? If we were to ask parents, why are you homeschooling? Why are you interested in homeschooling? Most parents are homeschooling because they're afraid of the world. That's why. They think that their children are good and that the world is bad, and if they put their children in the world, their children will become bad. And that's partly true, because Proverbs teaches us that bad company corrupts good morals. So that's partly true. The problem, however, is that the Christian mission is to go into the world and make disciples. So at some point, we've got to engage with the non-Christian world. We've got to have a faith. We've got to have a way of life and a mission that engages, and it engages in a winsome way. We are the influencers. We are not the influenced. We are the influencers. And when you look at Christian culture, you find that Christians are not the influencers. And so the concern we have with the world is that the world is active in influencing, and Christians are negligent with respect to influence. And that's really the concern. It's not that the world is going to corrupt us, it's that we enter into the world with this sort of passive attitude, like we're supposed to be consuming things, we're supposed to be receiving things from others, when in fact, we're supposed to be the ones giving and providing. We're supposed to be the ones leading. That's what it means to be the light of the world. We shine the way. We're the ones showing what should be done. We're bringing the light of divine revelation into human life and showing people where to go. And so the problem with Christian society, it's not that the world is out there. The world was always out there. The problem is that, especially in recent generations, we've decided that we're going to be consumers. We're going to go into the world receiving and absorbing and consuming things that are done and provided by others. And that's what's making the world dangerous. Not that the world itself is dangerous, but our approach to the world, our interaction with the world is what's actually dangerous. So that's the first problem. That's why there's no good Christian schools, because the schools are imitating rather than innovating. They're imitating rather than leading. They're following rather than showing other people the way. And so we've got, for example, Christian schools that are arranged with this K-12 model. And if we asked, where in the world did Catholic schools or Christian schools, where did they get the idea to organize K-12 schools? Did Christians gather together and say, hey, you know what we should do? We should organize the school into these grade levels based on the birth dates of the children. No, there was no Christian group or Christian conference that led to that model. That model was designed by the world, and Christians simply followed it. And all of the mess of modern Christian education is caused by Christian neglect of their mission, which is to lead and direct rather than follow. So when we look at who is interested in homeschooling, it's usually people who see this problem. They see this problem in the Christian schools, in the public schools. They see that it's worldly. It's really not focused on spiritual goals. It's not focused on wisdom. It's not seeking to challenge children intellectually. They know that it's not like the education that the saints received and the saints gave when they were teachers themselves. So they know that there's something wrong, and they think that the right solution is going to be found someplace else, and because there's no other option, it's got to be at home. And then they go and look for a quote-unquote homeschool program, and what they find are all of these programs who say the right things, but who do the same things. They say that they're different. They say that they're, restoring this or they're classical that. But when you really get down to it, they're doing the same things. They're just changing the appearance. They're rebranding modern education. And so there's no solution. And so the parents are not going deep enough. They're not going down to the root to ask, what do our children really need? And what do we need to help build to actually solve this problem? They're not taking responsibility for the problem that they are conscious of. They're sort of criticizing the failures of modern society, modern culture, and then turning to an alternative, but they're content with just anything that's different. And they're not willing to ask, is this actually the solution? Am I going far enough? Am I going deep enough? Am I cutting away enough of this diseased plant to actually get down to the healthy part of the stem, even if it's down to the root itself, so that this plant can grow healthily from this point forward? They don't go far enough. They leave the disease and just cut back a little bit and then pretend that what they've done is all that needs to be done. And they're just not taking responsibility. So for intellectual formation, you've got to ask yourself, are you going back far enough? Are you cutting down far enough to actually get back to where you should be, where your children should be? And if not, what's the point of cutting at all? If you're not going to actually cut back to the healthy part of the plant, why bother pruning at all? We've got to get back to the classical liberal arts, to classical philosophy and scholastic theology, because that's what Christian philosophy and Christian education are. That's what Christian education is. When Pope Leo XIII called for a restoration of Christian philosophy, it was very clearly understood, and this was the late 1800s. This wasn't the 1400s. This was the late 1800s. And Pope Pius X echoed everything Pope Leo XIII said, 20 years later or so in, I think it was 1910, when he spoke against the modernists. There is something called, or that can be called, Christian philosophy, and this is the purpose or the goal of Christian education, to pursue, to teach, to introduce our children to Christian philosophy. And if we're not cutting away this dying plant far enough back so that we get back to that root, we may be doing something different, but we're not doing something better. We're just doing something different. So that's the first challenge. So we've got to go back to the classical liberal arts curriculum, and that's what we offer in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. But we've got a lot more to think about. We've got cultural issues, social issues, family issues, all of these complicated, even business issues to think about, because they're all part of the problem in modern society, and we can't allow anything to remain that needs to be fixed or replaced. We've got to go in this to win it or not bother. And for most parents, they go into Christian education, they go into homeschooling, half-heartedly, looking to be different, but to not actually solve the problems. And if we're not willing to solve the problems, why bother, right? Why pretend that we're something that we're not? So when we talk about the kids, we say, well, will the kids be lonely? Let me ask you this. As a Christian adult, are you lonely? Are you engaged socially as a Christian should be engaged socially? There's never a day in my life where I say, oh, I'm lonely. I'm never lonely. In fact, the struggle for me is to find time to be alone. I'm trying to find time to be alone so that I can get studies done, work done, prayers done, and so on. I have a difficult time finding private time to do necessary tasks because I'm never alone. And so if I'm never lonely, how are my children who are going to be with me for homeschooling, how will they be lonely? And so I think one of the problems is that the parents themselves, the way that they live, they are lonely. And so they're worried that if their children spend time with them, the children are, like them, going to be lonely because they're not engaged socially. And so again, the problem is not whether the children will be lonely, but whether the parents are living with a social life that's appropriate for Christian people, and whether or not when they bring the children home to be with them, whether the children will come into a healthy Christian social environment or an unhealthy, isolated environment. So the problem is with the parents, not with homeschooling, not with the children. It's with the parents. What is the parents' culture like? So for example, homeschooling parents can go to daily mass. They can go to daily mass. They can have friends at mass. They can be engaged in the parish community on a daily basis because they're home. And so would that child be lonely? No, that child would be getting up in the morning, going to mass, seeing friends, talking to priests, talking to other parishioners, being involved in the parish. If it's a boy, it could be serving at the altar. There's all of this activity that in a healthy Catholic life, for the kind of person who would be thinking about homeschooling, active participation, active engagement in the parish should be normal. However, we find weird things going on in the families. So for example, we'll find that the family will say, well, we don't go to daily mass because we're a traditional Catholic family, and the parish we go to is actually 45 minutes away, and we can only go there on Sunday. So during the week, we don't go to daily mass. We drive 45 minutes to go to the Latin Mass parish on Sunday because that's the only time we can afford the drive. And so we don't go to daily Mass. Well, that's a social problem. That's a cultural problem. To have a Catholic life with no parish life, no local parish life, that's a social problem. And yes, if you bring a child into that social life, yeah, that child will be unnaturally lonely because of the parent's worldview and convictions. And that's the kind of problem I'm talking about. Does the parent have sufficient resources to provide the child with activities that are good and natural, good and necessary for the cultivation of human virtue? For example, will the child study music? Do the parents have the resources available and contacts to provide the child with dance lessons, music lessons, piano lessons, voice lessons? If the parents don't have money and don't have the skill themselves, let's say if mom is not capable of teaching her daughter how to sing, well, then mom is going to have to hire someone who is skilled at singing and who can teach vocal music or some instrument to work with the child. Do the parents have those resources? If not, yeah, the child is going to be bored and lonely because the resources just don't exist for the activities that the child needs to be tutored at home. So it's a financial concern. Do the parents have a realistic view of what it costs to raise children well? And for most homeschooling parents I talk to, I don't think they have realistic expectations for what the costs of good Christian culture are. There's this Protestant idea that material things and working for money, all of this stuff is worldly and bad and to be avoided. So people who don't work for money are good people, and people who work for money are like Scrooge. That's common among Protestants, where they just basically sit around waiting to get raptured, waiting to go to heaven, and they really can't explain what the purpose of men in this life is. If we become Christians as children or even as young adults, we've got 40, 50 years to live in this world. Our Christian worldview has to explain what the purpose of this temporal life is. And for most Christians, their worldview doesn't explain what the purpose of this temporal life is. And so they're lightly engaged, if engaged at all, in the modern market, in the modern workplace. They lack financial resources. They imagine that lacking financial resources is godliness. They imagine that pursuing financial resources is some kind of worldliness. And what they don't realize is that they're actually contradicting classical philosophy with that attitude. Aristotle in the Ethics teaches that material goods are necessary for virtuous living. Just think about the works of mercy. If it's merciful to provide food for the hungry, then it must be good to have food. If it's merciful to provide shelter for the homeless, then it must be good to own shelter. And if we think about the works of mercy, the things that are provided through the works of mercy are good. Therefore, the possession of those things must be good. But the real issue is, what is the intention in the possession of those things? That's what determines whether those things are actually goods or whether they're just some sort of evil, selfish hoarding of resources. So the works of mercy teach us that physical needs, possessions that provide for physical needs, are good. They should be possessed. They should be worked for, not to be hoarded, but to be shared. And that's ultimately the test of whether we're pursuing them rightly. It's whether we're pursuing them and sharing them, or whether we're pursuing them and hoarding them. And the alternative to pursuing and hoarding is not to not pursue. The alternative to pursuing and hoarding is to pursue and share. Like St. Paul says, you who stole, steal no longer, but rather work that you may share. That's the motive of our work. So if I can go and work and I can make enough money to cover my essential costs of living, That's great. But I don't stop working at that point and say, look, I've worked enough to pay my bills. I've worked enough to cover the costs of my life. Now I'm free. No, that's the parable of the man who built bigger barns and retired and doesn't live charitably. The fact that you have the ability to generate more wealth than you personally need means that you have the opportunity, the privilege of living mercifully and sharing with others and doing good works and storing up for yourself treasure in heaven. But that life of doing charitable works begins with profitable labor in this life. And that's where the modern Christian worldview, I think, is really flawed. We've got this lazy false dilemma, which is live like Ebenezer Scrooge on one side, or the alternative is to not work, to not earn money, to not seek worldly possessions. That's the alternative. And that's a false dilemma. As I said, the true alternative to hoarding is to work that you may share, which is actually a Christian view of work. So for many parents getting into parenting, they have children, but they have no concern, no responsible thoughts about the material needs, what the cultivation of human culture and happiness costs. It has a financial, real world cost, because any skill or any lesson, any art that our children will need as part of their formation, part of their cultivation, if we cannot be the source of that directly, like we cannot teach it ourselves, then we have to have a plan for how we're going to obtain it for our children. And so will a homeschool child be lonely? Well, if a parent has no resources available to provide the child with tutors or teachers in different arts and skills that are necessary for life, and the child is just going to sit at home doing nothing, maybe with a pile of workbooks on the table, and pretend that that's Christian education, yeah, that child's going to be lonely and bored. But that's not the child's fault, and that's not homeschooling's fault. That's the parent's fault, because the parent does not have a responsible or realistic idea of what education should look like, and the parent has not provided sufficiently for what that child needs. But you see how this false dilemma exists. Either the child is going to go to school where he can have friends and he can participate in extracurricular activities and all kinds of, maybe they have mass at school, they have confession at school. Oh, look at all these activities at school. They can make friends, social activities, extracurricular activities. Oh, look how great that is. The alternative is lonely homeschool. No, that's not the alternative. That's not the alternative. The alternative is not lonely, isolated homeschooling. That's a false dilemma. The alternative is an active life that's simply family-oriented. We don't need to send kids to school for the sacraments. They're available in the parish. We don't need to send kids to school to make friends. There are friends available in our neighborhoods, in the parish, and so on, in local homeschool groups. If you're interested in that, if you need some way to find friends for your children. And also for Catholic families, especially if families are having, a good number of children, there should be friends present in the home. I mean, for my kids, we have 10 children. My children never fight. They never fight. My children are together. They play together, they study together, they work together, they exercise together. They're together constantly all day long. If we have a problem in our family, it's that our kids are fooling around and having too much fun together. I'm being honest when I say our children never fight. I could probably count the times on one hand when our children have had fights, and they've been usually caused by some problem that one of the children was going through. But my children don't spend an hour of their day where they're not with a companion, their own brothers and sisters, in their own family life, doing all kinds of things together. And so again, like if you've got one child, Well, yeah, homeschooling is going to be lonely. Um, but you're going to have a plan for that. You're going to have some social solution. Now, the child doesn't need friends his own age. You could be the child's friend. But the question is, can you be a friend? Are you living an interesting, friendly, generous, active life that a child could participate in and find happiness? Or are you, just sort of selfishly going about your own tasks every day, thinking only of your work, only of what benefits you, and the child's just going to sit there while you do your work? Yeah, that's going to be a lonely life as a homeschool student. That's got nothing to do with the child. That's got nothing to do with homeschooling. That's got to do with your way of living. It's a selfish life. And everyone around you who is restricted to your fellowship is going to be lonely because you're just working on your own things. You may think that that's responsible. Say, oh, I get all my tasks done. Yeah, but your tasks, you're only focusing on some of your responsibilities and you're neglecting others, telling yourself you're getting all your work done when you're not getting all your work done. Again, you're not focused on the chief end. You're not thinking about the responsibilities you have to your child or to others. You've got yourself, you've got this view of your life pared down to just your personal needs and concerns, and everyone else can just go find something else to do. Yeah, the people around you are going to be lonely and bored, especially if they depend on you for their activity. So again, this draws attention to the problem of parenting and parent culture. So what's the solution? Well, you can see that there are other issues to deal with. The issues may be financial. The issues may be social. They may be ecclesiastical. They may be doctrinal. They may be practical. They may be personal. And if a child is brought home to be educated by parents who themselves are not living a healthy Christian life, those children will have all kinds of social problems. And we see that very commonly in homeschooling. We see these kids who don't develop socially or personally or culturally. They're awkward around other people. Those are kids, I don't care what anybody says, those are kids who are being neglected by their parents. Neglected in a cultural sense, neglected in a social sense. I mean, there are things that I have to do for my kids that I have no interest in doing. For example, we go on a number of family vacations each year. We'll take the kids usually to the beach because we've got family at the beach. Kids love going out there. We spend a few days with my wife's parents or her brothers and sisters. Kids have a great time. We blow 3-4 days. I have no interest in going to the beach. I have no interest in sitting around small talking with relatives. But I do it for the kids' sake because it gets them. They have great relationships with their uncles and aunts, with their grandparents, with their cousins. They get to go and have some fun at the beach, get to know beach culture, things like that. They enjoy it. It's entirely for the children. It's also for my wife because it allows her to maintain relations with her family. But you can see that it's not just me deciding to do things that are good for me. There's absolutely no personal benefit for me to go and spend 3-4 days at the beach. I spend most of my time just working on my own stuff anyway. But we do that. We take days, go to the beach, go on vacation, do different things. My youngest daughter's in ballet classes. That requires a ton of money and running around for recitals and practices. She's at ballet camp today. There's lots of time spent. I had to go, pick her up the other day. That's for her sake. That's for her cultural development, for her social development. She's friends with all the girls she dances with. I have no personal benefit in that. I personally don't care if my daughter is a ballerina. I personally don't care if we learn how to dance in our family. It's for my daughter's sake. Is she lonely at home? No. My kids would never even think to say homeschooling is lonely. They just have no sense of that as homeschooling children. They've got all kinds of things that they do. But my wife and I have to live sacrificially, financially and personally, to make these things possible. this is really how we divide labor in our family. I take upon myself the burden of working to provide financially. And my wife takes upon herself the burden of providing culturally for the family. Now, my wife herself is not talented in all these different areas, and so she ends up being a runner who's bringing kids to places. And it's not crazy. It's not busy. My kids don't play sports, for example. A lot of that is just incredibly wasteful with respect to time. I did it as a kid, and I can't give an account for the time that I spent with all my traveling all-star baseball teams and basketball and football practices and camps and training sessions. I cannot give an account and say that that time was well spent. There are many other things I could have and should have been doing that I neglected for the sake of sports. And I would never let my kids do that unless one of them was extraordinarily talented and motivated and, you know, had reason to give himself to a sport. But just signing kids up for activities, running around all over the place crazy, that's not extracurricular activity. That's just busyness. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about purposeful, significant activities where you've got a student, for example, my daughter Anna, who I mentioned, goes to dance classes. My daughter Anna was in love with Shirley Temple when she was 4 years old. My daughter Anna spent her time standing in front of a television watching Shirley Temple, dancing like Shirley Temple. She asked, her Christmas list was for dance lessons, for ballet shoes, for tap shoes. It's all that she wanted. She dances 16 hours a day around the house, constantly dancing, constantly thinking about dance classes, talking about her dance classes, talking about her teachers, thinking about her lessons, practicing her lessons. Loves being at dance class. That's a good extracurricular activity. She meets girls there who share her interests, who like what she likes. They're actually good girls, good friends, and she gets to be with them whenever she's at dance practice. I would never sign up one of my other daughters for dance because they were never interested in dance. I would never sign up my boys for sports because they think sports are stupid. They think military life is cool. They think sports are like wannabe military activities. And historically, they were. My boys would rather be out hunting, shooting, lifting weights, exercising, running, getting ready for military careers. They have no interest in organized sports. I could force them to go play. I could sign them up and they would go play. It would be a total waste of time, totally unnecessary. So the activities have to be purposeful, but we have to be willing to engage in those activities to provide our children with good opportunities to develop friends with shared interests who are good friends. They come from a good quality of families that are focused on activities. It's not just like idle sitting around in their bedroom with their friend or idly playing in the streets, getting into trouble like I did. It's purposeful friendships in good locations, focused on an activity, and so on. So you just see there's more and more to think about, and it takes sacrifice for these things. It takes financial sacrifice. It takes personal sacrifice. We have to do things we don't necessarily want to do. I don't want to go to dance recitals, but I go for my daughter's sake. I go for the other girls' sake. I go for the ballet teacher's sake. I want them to know we support them. That's community involvement. Same thing with parish life. My kids like serving at Mass. They want to go serve at Mass. I've got to choose what times I go to Mass based on when they make arrangements to serve. That's another sacrifice I need to make. I can't just sit down and make my schedule and say, this is what I would like to do. And everyone else can go, chase their tails out in the field. I've got to allow my children to make decisions and be willing to sacrifice to allow them to do what they would like to do, good things. I've got to be willing to make financial sacrifices, sacrifices of my time, sacrifices in my own business pursuits. I have to wait often to work until the kids all go to bed. So I'm getting to work at midnight, and I'm willing to do that because it allows me to interact with my kids in ways that I need to. A kid comes home from college, he's got lots of questions, some practical problems he needs to solve. I'll spend all of my time with that kid who's visiting home and put my business off until everybody goes to bed. So I'm working from midnight to 3 or 4 in the morning to get my work done, and so that at the end of the day, when I finally lay down in bed, I've addressed all of my responsibilities, my social responsibilities, my cultural, religious responsibilities, and all of my personal business, occupational, vocational responsibilities. I do them on my own time. So, this work of homeschooling for parents is much more about parents and how they're going to live. It's not about homeschooling as if that's something else. It's not about the children, it's about the parents. The question of homeschooling is, what are you going to provide? What are you going to provide? It's not what the homeschool this or that program. No, they're not responsible for your children. You're responsible for your children. The children are not supposed to be content with nothing. They're not supposed to be content to be home with some workbooks on a table. Be grateful that they're given, you know, any opportunity. No, 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 no. That's not how parenting works. That's not how God parents us. God is generous. He pours out his rain upon the righteous and the unrighteous. He makes beautiful things in nature, delicious foods, fragrant flowers, beautiful birds. God is not this God of bare essentials. God is a benevolent, generous father, and that's the model of what we should look like as parents. So, those are the challenges of parenting. And the answer to the question, will my child be lonely? That's entirely up to you, the homeschooling parent. The question is not, will my child be lonely, but will you make your child lonely if he or she is homeschooled? And if your child is lonely as a homeschool student, that's your fault for a badly conceived, irresponsible, and ultimately selfish view of parenting and education. So, the good news, now that can all sound negative, and I know that if someone cut the talk off there, they could say, oh my goodness, he's so miserable, just always, no, no. This is the good news. And hopefully, if you listen to the whole talk, which few do, you'll get the good news. The good news is that this is in your control. If it was dependent on other people, if it was dependent on what schools were available, what programs were available, what services were available, all of this sort of stuff, what your child wanted and would do, that would be a miserable situation because there'd be nothing you could do about it. You might be in a place where there's just there's no resources available. That would be miserable, but that's not the case. This is in your control, and for me, even though that puts a great deal of stress on me personally, I'm happy to have that stress because it means that it's in my control and I can do something about it. So that's the challenge that I would leave you with today. I would put all the pressure on you as the parent, all the responsibility, all the accountability. But I would say, hey, the good news is that you can do something about it. And that's what's going to determine ultimately whether your homeschooled child gets a great intellectual formation at home and is happy or is left with some poorly conceived plan for education and is lonely. It's up to you. And I challenge you to take responsibility for it. And I assure you that everything you need to give your kids a happy education at home is available. The question is simply whether or not you're willing to do it. I hope that's helpful. God bless.